Okay, good evening. You're very, very far away, but good evening. My name is Ervand Abrahamian. I'm a faculty member here at NYU in the Department of Middle East and Islamic Studies. I'm also a member of the Iranian Studies Initiative Steering Committee, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this evening's event. This evening's talk, Nostalgia for the Old Regime, is part of a larger initiative that we at ISI have organized and we've taken advantage of the 40th anniversary of the Iranian Revolution to reflect on the uprising and the many different forces that made it possible and the multiple, sometimes contradictory consequences after the fall of the monarchy and the creation of the Islamic Republic. Before introducing this evening's speaker, as well as our two discussants, let me take a moment to thank the various organizations who have helped make this event possible. Specifically, besides the ISI Iranian Studies Initiative, I'd like to thank the Gallatin School of Individualized Study for their support, including this wonderful space. We'd also like to thank the Kevorkian Center of Near Eastern Studies, the Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies, and finally, the Global Research Initiative, Office of the Provost of New York University. So this evening, we are fortunate to have Professor Ervand Abrahamian present his thoughts and analysis on nostalgia for the old regime. Ervand Abrahamian is a distinguished professor emeritus of Iranian and Middle Eastern history and politics at Baruch College and the Graduate Center in the City University of New York. He has taught there for over 40 years and only recently has retired, but remains incredibly active and, in fact, prolific in various aspects of research, giving talks, and writing. He's the author of numerous books and publications. I'm not going to list all of them here, but let me just mention a few of his important monographs. First, we have Iran Between Two Revolutions. We also have the Iranian Mujahedin, one of my favorite works of his. Then we have an important collection of essays titled Khomeinism, a book titled Tortured Confessions, and most recently, a book that came out a couple years ago titled The Coup, 1953, the CIA and the Roots of Modern U.S.-Iran Relations. In all of these works, Ervand has demonstrated a careful reading of primary sources, a keen sociological eye, and unique awareness of the multiple and changing terrains of Iranian politics. And what's important about his work, he reminds us that politics in Iran extends far beyond the monarch, the court, the supreme leader, and the so-called mullahs. He is currently working on a book on the 1979 revolution in Iran. In 2011, he was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Let me just take a moment to point out that besides all of these accomplishments, awards, and publications, Ervand is a beloved colleague for many of us in Iranian studies, and is someone who has not only followed, but in fact supported many younger researchers and newer generations over the years. And in many respects, he's a role model for the entire field of Iranian studies. And it's a pleasure to acknowledge that here this evening and have him be our keynote speaker for our conference. We're also excited this evening because we have two stellar scholars who are going to be our discussants for Ervand's paper. In the order that they will present, we'll first have Negar Mottahedeh, who's an incredibly productive and prodigious scholar working in multiple disciplines. Negar holds a PhD in comparative studies from the University of Minnesota and a BA in international relations from Mount Holyoke College. Currently, she teaches media studies in the program in literature at Duke University in North Carolina. Her research on film, social media, and social movements in the Middle East has been published in a number of journals, or numerous journals, and at least 5 single-authored monographs. Let me just mention a few of these. In 2008, she authored Displaced Allegories, Post-Revolutionary Iranian Cinema. A few years after that, she published #Iran Election, #Solidarity and the Transformation of Online Life, which was published in 2015. And just a few weeks ago, the Stanford University Press, that's been in the news quite a bit these last few days, published her most recent book, Whisper Tapes, Kate Millett in Iran. Her work on the global culture of memes and selfies have featured at the Victoria Albert Museum in London, at the Museum of Moving Images in New York, and TEDx. Finally, I'm also very happy to announce that she has recently been promoted to full professor, a recognition that is much deserved, and I believe this may be her first talk as a forthcoming full professor. Our second discussant will be Naghmeh Sohrabi, who is the Charles Corky Goodman Professor of Middle East History and the Associate Director for Research at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. She too has exciting news to share with us. She was recently informed that she earned tenure. Congratulations, Naghmeh. It's not every day that I get to say that. Naghmeh holds a BA from MIT in history and biology and a PhD from Harvard in history and Middle East studies. She is the author of the book Taken for Wonder, 19th Century Travel Accounts from Iran to Europe, and numerous other articles on 19th and 20th century Iranian history, as well as various pieces on post-revolutionary politics and culture. She is the 2014 recipient of the Andrew Mellon New Directions Fellowship, as well as a recipient of a Mellon Sawyer Seminar Fellowship in Comparative Revolution in 2017-2018. She received this along with Greg Childs. She is currently working on a book on the experience of the 1979 revolution in Iran. So join me in welcoming our speaker, Ervand Abrahamian, and after that, our discussants.
Thank you, Arang, for the introduction. I'd also like to thank Ali and Arang from Kevorkian for organizing this meeting, and also Hamid Dabashi, who's not here, from the Charter Center, Columbia, also helped organize. Eric Hobsbawm, reviewing Hannah Arendt's book on revolution, starts the review saying, revolutions are very difficult to analyze satisfactorily, surrounded as they are and must be by a cloud of hope and disillusion, of love, hatred, and fear, of their own myths and myths of counter-propaganda. One can add to that also the feelings of nostalgia. The idea of nostalgia and the presence of nostalgia, of course, is not limited to revolutions. It seems to be a common and a universal phenomenon. Nowadays, in contemporary America, we tend to be, or some people seem to be nostalgic about the 1950s. I'll get to around why that area sounds to be appealing to conservatives. If you go to Europe, there's a great deal of nostalgia for the age of empire, 19th century, especially in France and Britain. In the Soviet Union, there have been a number of public opinion polls where over 50% of the people are nostalgic for the age of Stalin and the 1930s. Probably if you carried out similar surveys in Germany, you might find also surprising nostalgia for a period of the 1930s. So nostalgia seems to be something that is expected and quite common. So it's not surprising that with Iran, and especially in Iranians abroad, there is some nostalgia for the old regime. Here, the difference, I think, from the other forms of nostalgia is that this type of nostalgia is actually very well funded and orchestrated. there is, you can say, a large industry of, especially on internet, of portraying the old regime in a very different light, not necessarily the light in which people who lived through it, but invariably in a nostalgic form of perception and memory. And these programs I'm thinking mostly of Manitou, are very well professionally done. They're not clearly done by amateurs or activists who are just making films. They're actually, I would say, filmmakers assigned the task of creating nostalgia for the old regime. And any looking at their programs, you can see in fact, very professionally done how it's done. Even the music, invariably, when you have a thing about the Islamic Republic, the music is like a horror movie music. Then if you go back, it's the old period, you have soothing, charming music where everything seems to be in order, clean, and so on. So here you have, I would say, a whole industry of creating nostalgia. Now, in other nostalgias, there's usually something one can latch onto of the past that you can say, well, there's something rational that people are thinking and are nostalgic about. For instance, in contemporary America, people who are conservatives are nostalgic about the 50s. One can account for this. Clearly, for the 50s, for conservatives, this was a period where America was great, society was stable, people knew their places. White, middle-aged Protestant men were not an endangered species. Women knew their place. Minorities knew their place. The word gay was not even invented. So this was, you could say, they would have a rational reason for being nostalgic for that period. Similarly, in the Soviet Union, people were nostalgic for the Stalin period. This is a period where, of course, there was rapid industrialization, there was the Great Patriotic War, and, of course, Stalin led the victory over the Third Reich. So invariably, there's something you can say on the past that you could say there's a rational explanation why people are nostalgic. So when we come to the situation with Iran now, what is it in the past that one would feel nostalgic, or one can explain the nostalgia? Here I would like to actually separate Reza Shah period from the Mohammad Reza Shah period. I think there's the nostalgia for the Reza Shah period. There is some rational explanation for that, in that people are nostalgic for that era. It's people who saw that period as a period when the state was built, that really you had the creation of a standing army, the creation of ministries, bureaucracy. And you could say Reza Shah began the reign without really a modern state. By the end of his reign, there was established a state for the first time in Iranian history. So people who sometimes say, well, the only thing wrong with Reza Shah was that he was not a good Muslim. I think what they're really talking about is that he did establish a centralized, viable state. There were a lot of problems with the state, but at least it was something that he did create. But how far is this history a usable history for the present? I can't imagine people who are nostalgic for the Reza Shah state want that state to become bigger, wider, more deeper into society. In fact, I would have thought people who are discontented, would want actually less of a state, more of a limited state, and cutting down of the state rather than more bureaucracy, more ministries, more civil servants. So this part of, I think, nostalgia is not really a usable history for the present. Now, going to the Mohammad Reza Shah period, here it's more complicated. When you look at the networks, especially one or two, when they're depicting nostalgically the Reza Shah period, the Mohammad Reza Shah period, they're invariably looking at him as a great nationalist leader, a man who basically put Iran on the map, made Iran a military force in the Persian Gulf, a man who created one of the largest armies in the Middle East, more tanks than United Kingdom, also a man who headed the OPEC, forced basically the Western countries to give higher prices for OPEC. He also is supposedly to have then put the West in its place. In fact, one of the recent biographies of the Shah, which very much fits in this nostalgia, the author Andrew Cooper argues that Mohammad Reza Shah basically made the greatest transfer of wealth in world history by forcing the increase in the oil prices in 1973-74. So when people, I think, look at now Mohammad Reza Shah, they see him as a great national leader that who put Iran on the map. As one royalist recently said to me, the real Mottahedeh of Iran was the Shah. So I would say this is the sort of image that people could latch on to make the Mohammad Reza Shah as something to admire, to look back on and see as a great figure. In fact, at the time, of course, if you go back, you remember with the rise of OPEC prices, of course, there was a credible jump in oil prices from 73. It was something like $2 a barrel, jumped to about $5 a barrel, then to $9 a barrel. This was seen as a major historical shift in the balance of world wealth. The Economist, in fact, at that time, just to quote, this was at the time of the price rise, even after 20 years, the ghost of Mottahedeh, the politician who laid claim to the mantle of Iranian nationalism and outbid the Arabs in challenging the West, still haunts the Shah. By representing the initiative at OPEC conference, the Shah has once again seized the leadership of the region from the King Faisal and Sheikh Yamani. And of course, at the height of the oil crisis, the U.S. Treasury, Simon, described the Shah as a nutcase. Here was a direct confrontation between the West and, you could say, Iran on the oil prices. And this has gone into public memory of the Shah as being the militant vanguard of rising the oil prices. And of course, in that whole discourse and back and forth, the Shah started lecturing the West about being lazy, being promiscuous, wasting resources, and that the West should really tie up its boots and also become more hardworking. So this has become part of public memory of what the Shah was. So much so that later on, people then created the notion that the reason the revolution occurred was because the Shah had got too uppish, had become critical of the West, had become too friendly with the Palestinians, with the Arabs, and was trying to raise prices even more, and therefore the West had a reason to get rid of the Shah, and that's why the revolution happened. And of course, the Shah himself subscribes to this in his final books about that the revolution was caused because he had become critical of the West. So he was presented, you can say, he presented himself as an anti-imperialist, militant nationalist. And this, I think, has become into the public memory of what was important about him. And so you can criticize him for being dictatorial or whatever, but he's seen as a true representative of Iranian nationalism in basically the tradition of Mottahedeh, and even doing better than Mottahedeh. So the question is, in fact, what's reality? Is this pure nostalgia, mythology, or is there something substantive into this whole image? Is this a false memory, or is there some truth in it? And here I think what the recent documents, release of documents, especially the Foreign Office archives, State Department archives, WikiLeaks, CIA, what's called the library on internet. What these documents show is that much of this is, in fact, if not all of it, is pure mythology. So this is not a nostalgia based on something you can actually latch onto. It's latching onto something that really was not there. For example, let's take over the OPEC prices. The OPEC prices went up not because of the Shah. They went up because of the Arab embargo when there was the Arab-Israeli war, and it was the Arab states, with some exceptions like Iraq, the Arab states carried out the embargo, and there was a fourfold jump in the oil prices. The Shah had absolutely nothing to do with it. The fact that the vanguard of this jump in the oil prices was Gaddafi. And Gaddafi's main advisor turned out to be a Lebanese oil economist who had studied the Mossad experience and basically had some smarts about how to run around the oil companies, and succeeded. And then the other Arab countries were able to continue that same line of raising prices by cutting production. Here, in fact, the Shah was very weak. Despite the public image, it was basically a lot of grandstanding in OPEC, going to OPEC and saying oil prices should go up. But the Shah, in fact, if you look at what was going on internally in the embassies and with the oil companies, the Shah actually was completely weak on this. He had no cards to play, mainly because, ironically, Iran had not nationalized its oil industry. Again, the image here was that after 54, NIOC, the oil company, was running the industry. The oil companies were basically service companies. And Iran had retained what Mossadegh had done in 51. In reality, what you find in the internal documents is that the Shah and Iran had no control over oil production inside Iran. It was the oil companies that continued to decide how much to produce. So at times you would find the Shah wanting the oil companies to increase production so he could get higher revenue, but in fact the oil companies would cut production because if the Iranian oil was not competitive with crude oil from Saudi Arabia. So they were not in the business of pleasing the Shah, they were in the business of making profits. So if it wasn't in their interest to make profits, they weren't going to listen to the Shah's word about increase or lower production. So here what you really have is the Shah having no control over actually the oil industry in Iran, and therefore being in a very weak position, but grandstanding in OPEC, sending people to, like Al-Muzagar, to OPEC to say, yes, we should raise oil prices. But that was meaningless unless you were willing to cut oil production, because the prices very much depended on production. And the Arab countries could cut production because they had mostly nationalized oil by 1973-74, but Iran had not. So here what you're really seeing is basically a phony, nationalism, where he is acting in the public arena as being very militant, but in reality, even if he wanted to be militant, he was not in a position to do it because he didn't control the oil industry. And you see in private actually correspondence of the British ambassador saying, yes, the Shah was a hawk on oil prices, but this only lasted 3 months. And Al-Muzagar, who later got a reputation of being a hawk, privately would always assure the oil companies that he didn't like that term. He was not a hawk on oil prices. So what you find here really is the regime was piggybacking on the real rise in the oil prices, which the Arab countries had actually done, and he was the beneficiary of this. And of course, with the big jump in the oil prices, you had a huge, influx of money to Iran, basically jumping from about 5 billion to about 20 billion a year. And this gave the Shah a great deal of money to spread around. And this provided him with the opportunity to become like Cyrus the Great or some Achaemenian emperor, where other people were coming to the court. Of course, in the ancient days, they came to present gifts or bounty to the Shah. In this case, actually, they came to Tehran to basically get loans. So this is often seen as him as a great imperial power, with all these smaller countries coming and begging for money. So you have figures such as you can see in the 1970s. You're talking about actually big sums where India gets a loan of something like $1 billion. Smaller countries get, $500,000-$600,000 in loans, and of course the Shah is spending money and investing money in Coup, in Western companies, and so on. And this gives him the image of grandeur of a major player in international world. Sure, he has the money, but it's not a money because of any actions Iran or he had done. It's because of what actually the countries that had nationalized their oil had been able to do. Similarly, you find in this period, of course, there is the big celebrations at Persepolis, where he invites all the great leaders of the even major or smaller countries to come to Persepolis. And this was seen as a way of showing that Iran was on the map. The Shah was a real imperial power, and all these heads of states were coming to pay basically their respects to the Shah. Again, this remains in the public image, especially in the internet, as the height of imperial power. Of course, at that time, the Persepolis celebrations did not go that well. If you read some of the journalists that were there, they were very critical, and in some ways it was actually not a bash that outdid all bashes. It was quite an embarrassment. And this, of course, we did inside Iran was became counterproductive because of so much criticism of the millions being spent on a big party to fly in food, wine from France, because Iranian food was not supposed to be good enough for Western dignitaries. And of course, added insult to injury, some major state leaders, including Nixon, didn't bother to show up. Queen Elizabeth, of course, didn't show up, and so on. So it was, in a way, an attempt to create a great glory of Iran, which at that time didn't even work. But nowadays, that image, that celebrations are still used to create the image that this was Iran at its height, because the Shah had put Iran on the international map. Similarly, on politics, the Shah claimed towards his end of his life that he had become great friends or supported the Palestinian cause and supported liberation movements in Africa. Again, the reality is very different. In private correspondence, in the confidential materials, you find exactly opposite. The Shah was adamant that the Palestinian state should never be created. He also was actually, surprisingly enough, funding terrorist guerrilla groups in Africa that were supported by South Africa, the apartheid regime, in Mozambique, Angola, Congo, and so on. These were basically money that the U.S. didn't want to spend, and they got Iran to spend it or to finance them on behalf of the United States. So the myth that really the Shah had become critical of the United States and had different policies to the United States doesn't really hold water when you look at what was going on behind the scenes. And of course, on Vietnam, Kissinger thanked the Shah for being one of the few countries that publicly supported United States on Vietnam. So the idea that somehow the Shah was a militant nationalist, willing to challenge and stand up to the West, this was a good image that is used, but in reality, in politics, he was not doing those things. He was actually doing exact opposite. And again, Kissinger, Nixon saw his value in that, and they still continue to see him as a major, basically a bulwark, United States bulwark in the West. I think the most damning statement one can look at, see in terms of the Shah's role, is in Andrew Cooper's final statement in his book on oil kings. Someone once asked Helms what he really thought of the Shah. We usually think that the Helms and Kissinger really great supporters of the Shah. Helms' answer to the question, what do you think of the Shah? Helms' answer said, well, neither I nor Kissinger ever took the Shah seriously. I can't imagine a worse put down as that. Here is a man who thinks himself as a great imperial lord and a great ally of the United States, but he was never taken seriously by his closest friends in Washington. So I would say there is very little in terms of reality in the past that can politically one can be nostalgic. There might be social reasons, others that commentators might want to deal with, but when it comes to in terms of national prestige, national power, one can say in Russia, well, Stalin did lead the country to victory in World War II. That's the reality. But you can't really say to the Shah, he made Iran great under his period. Anything greatness there was really money, but that money was from the things that outside his doing. Now, this basically orchestration of nostalgia actually goes beyond just the nostalgia realm. If you look at articles that appear not only in the media, but in journals, in the Standard, Weekly Standard, there's even something called Persepolis blog. They create these images of the coup of '53, that the idea of the coup is a myth, that it basically the CIA had nothing to do with it, that the whole idea is so magical, a complete fantasy, and that basically what happened in 1953 it was a popular Riyam uprising, not a coup. And if they use the word coup, it was a counter coup because Mossad had tried a coup, and the royalists had done a counter coup. And these articles actually that appear almost every year on the anniversary of the coup, they use even the same words, the word myth, conventional wisdom, fantasy, and that the argument is that the CIA had no role in it at all. If it had any role, it was insignificant, that it was the people, or especially the clergy leading the people, carried out the coup. As if irony in this, because the royalists even blamed the mullahs for the coup, as they don't want to admit that the military actually carried out a coup. So here I can say, again, an orchestrated attempt, not just create nostalgia, but create a false history of the important period in the past. This revisionist is not limited to the past, is not limited to reinterpretation. It goes even actually further to rewriting the past. I will end with one basically mind-boggling example. If you compare the newspaper Etelat that was published under Mottahedeh from 51 to 53, and then go to website and look at Etelat, it's known as the new series published by royalists, it is staggering the difference. The Etelat of 51-53 was actually good journalism. It reported really what was happening. It gave the views of different groups. It was usually had a column where the journalist had talked to Mossad and gave basically the official view of the government. Then it covered the Majlis debates. It covered basically opposition activities. So you can really see at that time this was objective journalism, professional journalism at that period. It's also surprising because at that time MI6 and CIA had bought most of the editors of newspapers and journals. Somehow they didn't get to the Etelat. So Etelat remained actually highly, I would say, professional. You look at the new version of going back to that period, they completely rewrite what was happening. So the new version doesn't give any objective. What they talk about is basically, on one hand, is Dictature Mohammad Mottahedeh. The other side is the Mashroutiyeh Shahenshahi. So the conflict now is portrayed as if Etelat at that time saw it as a conflict between the dictator, prime minister, and the constitutional monarch. So this is more than just actually reinterpreting or revising history. It's much more like an Orwellian, shred in Orwell's 1984, people shredded the past. In this case, it's actually completely rewriting the past to fit in and to create a feeling of nostalgia of the old regime. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ali and Arang, for inviting me to respond to Ervand Abrahamian's paper. I'll read because otherwise I'll get off course. Closely related to the operation of memory and its distortions, to fantasies and amnesia, Freud developed in the early days of 1899 the concept of screen memories, a concept that Ervand Abrahamian's reference to Manoto and that channel's mediation of nostalgia for the old regime evokes for me. This is, to my knowledge, the only time in his entire oeuvre that Freud conceives of an early memory as a screen for a later event, a move that makes innocent a thought originating in the present by attributing it to an unsullied past. Writing against an autobiographical current, Freud questions in his piece on screen memories whether we have any memories at all from our childhood, arguing that memories relating to our childhood may be all that we possess. In this articulation, childhood memories show our earliest years not as they were, but as they appeared in a later period when the memories were aroused. The childhood memories were formed precisely in these latter moments of arousal for it, and Freud attributes a number of motives to the selection and formation of these memories, in which historical accuracy plays not even a minor role. That I mention this is to underscore that in the process of reconstructing the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, one has to wonder when, if ever, nostalgia is based on any kind of accuracy in memory or history. A screen memory is a pure contrivance, a shield, albeit vivid, that makes innocent an idea in the present by its attribution to the innocence of childhood. For how can we in any way account for what the rising stars of our field, scholars such as Amy Malik, have referred to as a displaced nostalgia, or come to understand the kind of inherited nostalgia that Neda Maqbooleh sees employed by the 1.5 and second generation Iranian Americans? In these ranks, many were born and in the very least raised entirely within U.S. institutional context. Yet most of them take great pains to engage the kind of nostalgia attached to pre-revolution cultural objects so as to grasp a sense of their own identity and belonging. Indeed, so much of contemporary Iranian cinema, art, and television is expressive of this displaced generational nostalgia for the music, for the leisures, for the preoccupations, the gestures, and fashions of a period which passed before the generation was even born. In the rustle of the aged yellow papers, in the folds of these coats and gowns, in the layers of sound and brushed oil paint, in the photo albums and home movies of old, the spectacle of a magical past is a heightened visual iconography and a perceived authenticity that longs, a nostalgic longing for an existence which is no longer possible, was in fact never possible. Romanticized, this longing reflects both vividly and imaginatively the way we never were, and focuses on the foreclosed possibilities of a subjunctive nostalgia, to evoke Amy Malek's coinage, nostalgia for what could have been. At the core of the heightened visuality of these screen memories in the 1970s, at the core of the heightened visuality of these screen memories is the 1971 celebration of the 2,500 years of the Persian Empire. And what is striking to me is the uncanny ways in which the Persepolis celebrations follow the fundamental processes articulated by Freud in the orchestration and formation of screen memories, arousing and staging the age of Cyrus and Darius in ways that make innocent the attributes of the King of Kings and the tropes of his white revolution, arousing, forming, and linking these to an innocence passed on at a later an innocent past at a later historical moment. Consider the vividness with which went into the formation of these screen memories. 18 tons of food, 360,000 eggs, 60,000 troops, 25,000 bottles of wine, 12,000 bottles of whiskey, 250 bulletproof limousines, 47 kilometers of silk, 6,000 costumed soldiers, a block of ice delivered in the middle of the desert every day, and a field of newly planted trees speckled with 50,000 imported sparrows, life forms that never could have survived the heat of the desert landscape in which these memories were formed. In the tiled stuccoed Bagh Iram, which upended the beehived hairdos that lined up to greet a monarch that could So in the tiled stuccos Bagh Iram, dust winds upended the beehived hairdos that lined up to greet a monarch who could flawlessly switch from French to German, from Persian to English with a casual, easy flair. It is not just that the Pahlavi era's staging and formation of screen memories it is not just the Pahlavi era staging and formation of screen memories that gives shape to the contemporary nostalgia for the old regime, but also the shift in focus in the work of the journalists writing at the time. Indeed, while a world of rulers were invited to a first-class party with the King of Kings, a cattle of journalists were flown in to write about them. And as Charlotte Curtis, who was the first woman to have her name listed on the New York Times senior masthead underscored, just because you understand Keynesian economics doesn't mean you can't understand when someone picks up a cup of tea. By the early 1970s, reporting had become society writing. The world was changing, and for Curtis and her colleagues, society was the entire human race. The nostalgia for this moment, the will to embrace screen memories, was made global by such means. And in most settings, its triumph jettisoned all hopes for what Walter Benjamin called a revolutionary nostalgia, namely an attempt to counter the present political order through an active summoning of the traditions of the oppressed. What stands out as I turn to history is how the Iranian post-election crisis of 2009 was fueled by this latter form of collective nostalgia, a revolutionary nostalgia that would relentlessly return to the chants and gestures, to the streets and squares of the Iranian Revolution, to a people's ascent, to raise the shattering cry of Allahu Akbar from the rooftops and balconies of a city drenched in blood, a nocturnal soundscape misty with smoke and soot. Born in solidarity, collectivity, and kinship, the revolutionary nostalgia of the summer of 2009 was recorded on social media platforms, this time by an emergent figure we named the citizen journalist, an eyewitness and an activist who moved amongst the protesting masses, reporting on a present toward which the attention of a watchful global collective had turned for the first time online. That digital moment of collectivity and expansive freedom is long gone. And so I want to close by contrasting the revolutionary nostalgia of the summer and autumn of 2009 with an emergent form of media production and consumption that now defines the transformed world of cable, online streaming, and much of network television, a world that is epitomized by the mass turn in Iran and in the diaspora to the nostalgic historical serial Shahrazad. Characterized by binge watching, that is an accelerated form of acceptable addiction, a centered mode of delivery on the production side, and on the promotion of a social autism that devalues social relations on the reception side, seriality thrives on fragmentation, atomization, and narrative snippets that make it difficult to construct any memory of its parts. Constantly shifting to the new or the next thing, this morphine drip we call seriality, as Dennis Broe notes in his book Birth of the Binge, is patterned on capital's new model of perpetual productivity and on the integration of work and leisure. In a world that is more and more unequal, a world needing reinforcement by new forms of militarization, the digital world has become capital's only hope, a beacon for its promise of abundance and the site for the last pretension, for its last pretensions to equality. Filtered by algorithms and baited by clicks, viewers here participate in producing an acceptable form of social disconnectedness, widely held to be an appropriate response to the intolerable conditions of the contemporary global conjuncture, namely unemployment, vast income disparity, and global climactic destruction. Television seriality and the binge of Instagram stories, YouTube serials, and whatever is on Manoto are an integral part of a strained abundance in which the kinship and collectivity of both fandom and socially conscious action is drained by capital of its radical possibilities and becomes instead an integral part of the labor crucial to building the commercial structures of the networks and platforms on which binge thrives. While the operation of nostalgic content is captivating, its modes of reception and circulation are at present libidinally and aggressively tied to the new and virtual expression of the movement of capital, and importantly to the devastating destruction of all collective structures that may stand in its path. Thank you.
All right. I can promise you guys I'm neither as erudite nor as eloquent as the previous speakers. But I first want to thank Arang and Ali for inviting me. And of course, it's quite an honor to be here. I have a series of thoughts. So as I was listening to Ervand speak, I was thinking back to the fact that I was almost killed by nostalgia. And by that, I mean that years ago when the Crown Prince, Reza Pahlavi, was making his rounds, and he was, talking in different places. I went to an event, and he was presenting this image of his father's reign. And I got up, and I was an insolent grad student, and I said something. And then the next day, I went to the dentist. And I'm lying on the thing. I did not think of the fact that he had a Persian name had anything to do with what happened the day before. And I was just lying there, and he brought the Novocaine close, and then he said, "I saw you there last night." And then he proceeded to cry. that I had insulted the memory of the king. So when you were talking, I was actually thinking about nostalgia can be many things, and Negar brought out all that. It can also kill you. But in all seriousness, so Professor Abrahamian sort of gave examples of the way in which nostalgia works historically with the USSR and a series of other cases. But I actually was thinking to myself that, so I was remembering several years ago when in Nicaragua there had been these student protests. And one of the things, and this was when Ortega was standing for his third time for president, and one of the stories that I was hearing was this dual story that was going on, one of which was, of course, Ortega's nephew saying that he had a claim, not Ortega, but Somoza's nephew saying that he now had a claim. And his claim was precisely that in the aftermath of the Nicaraguan revolution, there's a lot of goodwill now towards not the Somoza that was overthrown, but his father, who was the good Somoza. And at the same time, what was going on was something that Negar, I was really happy she brought up, which was this idea of what was happening was that the students who were going out to the streets were recycling the revolutionary slogans from 1979. And they precisely, actually, I remember being very struck by the expression that what was going on with the students was revolutionary nostalgia. And I raise this because as you were speaking, I was thinking about, okay, so what other kinds of nostalgia beyond the kinds that you guys laid out is there, and how can, if we kind of unpack it, what can we understand about what's going on? And I thought of two or three more things, one of which was, I think it's also important to remember that it's not just Manoto who's putting what you call funny money behind the production of nostalgia. Of course, the Basij and the work of Narges Bajorli does a really good job of showing this. Much of the younger generation of the Basijis are very much fueled by an industry of nostalgia. Here, the nostalgia is nostalgia for the Iran-Iraq war. And it's an impetus towards action for them coming out of precisely the same kind of economics and politics that is fueling the monarchic nostalgia. And then, of course, what Negar mentioned, which is the revolutionary nostalgia of 2009. And I was specifically thinking about it in terms of the way in which the song Yad Dabistani Man keeps it just keeps unwinding into the past. It becomes a song of the 2009 Green Movement, referencing what it was, which was in the 1997 election of President Mohammad Khatami, and then from 1997, kind of referencing back to the 1980 song, which had to do with student movements, of course, and that. So where am I going with this? I don't know. We'll talk together and see where I'm going to go with this. So what I was thinking when I was listening to everyone was that, okay, so if we agree with both of you that nostalgia is not based on historical fact, then what does that do for us as producers of historical knowledge? And I think this is a really important question that I want to actually open up to both Professor Abrahamian and to Negar and Dr. Mottahedeh. That was not good of me. That's just because you're my friend. Which is, it's a real question in this day and age in particular when we're thinking about not just what Manoto is doing in terms of the creation of nostalgia, but that this nostalgia actually, much like the Basij nostalgia inside of Iran, is based in these larger networks of political power, and specifically right now with what is going on in the United States vis-a-vis Iran and the possibilities of some kind of action. And it's not because I was sort of trying to think about what does it mean in terms of this claim that is being made currently in the United States that the ultimate goal of the administration is not a military change in Iran, but it is a fueling of some kind of internal change. So a quest for another, basically creating a situation in which there would be another revolution. And as I was thinking about that, I realized that in some ways this spells, if we take what you both said at face value, which I see no reason not to, this actually, it spells some good news for us, because what I'm struck by in listening to both of you is the ways in which nostalgia, it does not create a call for action, even though we tend to think of it when we think about the monarchic, for example, or even in the Bastille. And what I meant by that is, you know, I spend a lot of time trying to think what makes a revolution, even though I tell my students if they ever ask me that question, I'll kick them out of class. But I think a lot about how is a revolution different from any other call for change or action towards change. And this becomes a really important question, I think, especially in this day and age in which there are so many different social movements going on. And obviously the impulse to call them all revolution is more of a reflection of the person who's calling it and what they would like the social movement to achieve. But I felt like this idea of nostalgia is actually a very interesting way of thinking about the ways in which a revolution is very, very different from other kinds of social change, in that revolutions do not have nostalgia. They are completely devoid of any kind of nostalgia for the past. I think about all the revolutions I know, and I think about the utopian dreams that they are based on. And very obviously, these utopian dreams are often fuzzy. Sometimes there's nothing in terms of what it wants from the future, but it often is very, very indifferent to any other models of being that went behind it. And so I wanted to end this my remarks on a really depressing note and say, you know, if nostalgia has nothing to do with historical reality, then what are we doing here? How can we combat kind of the troll farms that are going on based on nostalgia making? But at the end, I think there is a positive way of thinking about the current political situation, in that in some ways, the impulse to create change in Iran from within, i.e. to create a second revolutionary movement, goes against the kind of nostalgia-making machines that are there creating this sense of discontent. I don't think these two go together hand in hand. I don't think these two create actions. And the fact that these two impulses are at odds is the optimistic note that I will uncharacteristically leave you guys with. So thank you.
We have some time for questions and answers. I don't know. Would you like to take a couple minutes and respond to any threads?
Yes. Yeah, I agree that basically revolutions need a utopian future, looking for the future. But counter-revolutions, actually, I think, need nostalgia for something that they thought existed in the past. So in like 1848, 1660 in England, there was a nostalgia for the past, and this helped to create, I would say, a counter-revolution. So I think nostalgia is not purely sentiment. It can lead to political action. And I think people who fund Manitou are thinking along those lines.
I hear you. I'm not sure I agree with you, though, on that. I mean, especially with we're now going to get into 1848, and I think that's probably really off topic. But let's just stick to the case with Iran. I mean, is what is going on right now, is it a call for a counter-revolution? Is it not in some ways too late for that? And the fact that there are multiple centers of nostalgia going on, and some of which, actually a lot of which Negar kind of laid out also, does that not kind of counteract each other in some ways? So it's not a unified collective will, to use actually a term that Arash used in his paper. There's no collective nostalgia that's creating a collective will. And if there isn't that, then how can you propel that into action in some ways?
Yeah, I agree. It's more incoherent, or they're different sort of people moving into it, the whole idea of nostalgia. But generally, it creates this general premise that somehow something good was lost, and therefore, if you can regain it, that's a step forward. So.
We will open up the floor for questions for any of the speakers. Oh, I think we have a mic coming in your direction.
Thank you very much. Ervand, I thought it was interesting that you chose to focus on the sort of diplomatic history of the Pahlavi era when you're talking about nostalgia. I thought you would talk about more sort of the social history or the cultural history, which tends to be what's reproduced in the sort of Manotor narrative. I mean, there's even a thing in Brooklyn here called Disco Tehran, you know, where you can go and listen to Gugush. And so I think if you're going to look for a past in which there is a factual basis for nostalgia, it's probably the social freedoms that people enjoyed in Iran in the 1970s, which they just don't enjoy anymore, particularly sort of urban middle-class Iranians, many of whom are now in the diaspora and hear these stories from their parents. And so I think I don't really take the view that Manotor is generating that nostalgia. I think what it's doing is exploiting that nostalgia, which probably existed before Manotor for a whole generation. On the diplomatic front, which is something I've sort of worked on, I would strongly disagree with you with the view that the archives sort of reflect a view of Mohammad Reza Shah as this false nationalist. I think he was a nationalist, but he was a nationalist, an ethnic nationalist, as opposed to a civic nationalist that Mottahedeh was. And if anything, I think there's a consensus emerging in the historiography that he was far more autonomous from the United States than what a lot of people give him credit for. For example, I wanted to ask you, if you're going to talk about oil, I mean, what do you think, for example, of the 1971 Tehran Agreement, which was the precursor to the rise in oil prices in 73, 74? I mean, Chris Dietrich is here somewhere, I think, who can talk about it more intelligently than I can. But there was a notion that the Shah did play a really crucial role in a long process of resource nationalism, beginning in the 60s, beginning with the creation of OPEC, Iran, Venezuela, other countries. That was a process of slowly chipping away at the power of the oil companies. And that agenda of presenting himself as a third world nationalist, as you rightly point out, is very much driven by that memory of Mottahedeh that haunted him, you know, until the very end. So I guess what I'm trying to push you on is to say, you know, can we have a more gray and less black and white view of Mohammad Reza Shah? That's neither the Manotor rose-tinted kind of view that overlooks all the, you know, shortcomings of that period, but also one that acknowledges that the Shah was not the caricature that his opponents portrayed him as.
Yeah, I think you get to a difference for interpretation here. I think if you look at the public image and the persona the Shah created as a sort of standing up to the West, especially the oil companies, again, in the public arena, this is what it looked like. But again, I don't think in the private, confidential correspondence, that really comes through. The oil companies were very much running still the oil industry till 1979. You find even as late as 1978, the Financial Times saying, well, the companies are worried that if the revolution comes, we will lose control over oil here. If they say that, that means they don't have control, they still have control. And I think there was no real fuss about taking over of the oil companies in 79 because the contracts ended by 79. It just coincided with the revolution, so there was no real crisis. But until 78, 79, basically, the oil companies were in charge of how much they produced, not the Shah, not an IOC. And to me, that is the definition, meaning of what nationalization of oil means. If you don't control your industry, you're not nationalized. And so what I think the Shah cleverly did was on the public arena in OPEC, be very militant, saying, oh, prices should go up. But he really didn't have that control over prices. The only way you could control it was if you were willing to cut production. So what he was telling his Arab neighbors is, you cut production, and they knew that he couldn't cut production since it wasn't in his chain. So what I find is actually a lot of hot air, that this is a regime that is basically mirror and smoke and mirrors. And in reality, he knows that he has to work very closely with the West. And there are other cases where you come, basically is talking in public about, well, oil prices should go up. The West is wasting money and wasting resources. We need more. But when you look at the negotiations, he's quite eager to sell, barter agreements with Britain and United States. And of course, when you do a barter agreement, you can hide the price. And he even at one point is willing to fill up the reserves, the strategic reserves of United States at a price much lower than the going price. The only reason it doesn't work because Kissinger tells him, well, we'd have to go to Congress. And of course, if it went to Congress, then the price would be public knowledge, then other OPEC countries would know about this. So here, I mean, I'm not doubting his sentiment. He was probably felt himself a good patriot, Iranian nationalist. But when it came to actually diplomacy, when he's dealing with the Western powers, it's very much he knows the limitations of his power. And what he's trying to do is wiggle something out of that. But he knows that the real card is basically if you can control production. And he doesn't control production. The Arab countries, even the conservative Arab countries like the Saudis, do control production.
So maybe we'll take a couple questions. So Arash, and then if you could pass the microphone down a couple rows there.
Okay. Just wanted to talk about two notions. Number one, years before Manitou was founded, I was a sort of a Marxist high school organizer. There was such a thing in Iran. And I have to say, nostalgia for Pahlavi and support for Pahlavi and the belief that Pahlavi era was much better was widespread. In fact, if you were a Marxist organizer, you were always in a minority. And you had to battle against sort of those ideas. And also, of course, it was concurrent with the sort of international global, downgrading a revolution, the new liberal age, and all the sort of it. So I think I really find it strange, the sort of agency given to Manitou as having propagated and created this thing out of nothing almost. So, I mean, I'm not saying that you're suggesting, but sometimes in some sort of opposite and stuff, it comes off like that. So I want to say this had a larger. And the other thing is that I think we should separate nostalgia from conversations that Iranians are having about their history of their country and the relative place of the revolution. As someone who has always defended the revolution until the 40s, the event of the revolution, I think these conversations are interesting. Mustafa Tajzadeh, who can't exactly be accused of being a counter-revolutionary, a top reformist, said, for instance, that before the revolution, we complained that we have social rights and a lot of other rights, but we don't have political rights. But now we've also lost the political rights. He said this 2 weeks ago. I'm not agreeing with that, but I'm saying, so clearly debates over the revolution are not just sort of basically fought between some people in LA who just miss their villas in northern Tehran and sort of people in Iran who really love the regime. I think that really gives a strange image, and I think that should be separated. So I want to end by saying, echoing a lot of what especially Professor Mottahedeh and Professor Sohrabi also said, that perhaps what we have in our country now is a battle over nostalgias and battle over historical past, which is very much a battle over future of those of us like myself, or a lot of sort of people who sort of progressives in Iran who see something salvageable in the tradition of 79, who are proud of our fathers and mothers who fought against what was a nasty U.S.-backed dictatorship and brought it down, but who also looked at, of course, what came after was a much better, and a large number of young people in Iran who ask, why is it that the lives that they've led in so many real ways was, the country that they speaking diplomatically, I mean, Shah's government had good relations with also the Soviet Union, China, and all the Eastern Bloc countries, as well as the West, basically. So I think they're starting to have a more real and a more historically based view of the government before, and ask real questions about what was the, just like Cuba, just like Vietnam, a lot of other countries, what was the price paid for having an anti-systemic revolution, and what is salvageable from that tradition, and what can we go forward. So I think the battle of this is what you saw in 2009, and this is what you will see in all coming social movements in Iran, a battle over nostalgias and historical narratives, which is really a battle over our future.
Can we pass the microphone on? Can I ask everyone, I appreciate your excitement about this topic, but let's try to keep your comments to within less than 5 minutes, and ideally less than 2 minutes.
I will do my best. I have a question based on the 3 talks and also some of the comments so far, which is, I wonder if particularly Professor Abrahamian, you would speak a little bit more, or any of you would speak a little bit more about the difference between a sort of private nostalgia that anybody might have for something they perceive in their own past or in their parents' past or whatever, that may or may not have a sort of political direction, and then the questions and conversations about things like funding and funny money and so forth. In other words, in using the term nostalgia to describe this enormous gamut of affect and practice and mobilization and funding, I wonder if we're not all talking about slightly different things. So I just wonder if you, if you could just sort of speak to that a little bit.
Maybe one last question, yes, and then we'll open up the panel. Each of the panelists, if they'd like to comment on trying to refine or use alternative concepts for nostalgia.
Thank you so much. I'll try to keep it short as well. So in the definition of nostalgia, we're talking about something that no longer exists. And one thing I think that's important to note is that there's definitely no shortage of production of nostalgia or produced nostalgia in all its different facets and forms in the Iranian cultural climate. And out of which the nostalgia for the previous regime is a specific one, and is one that is kind of rising in specific ways at the moment, in ways that it hasn't been risen before. For example, in 2009, we saw the nostalgia of the Khatami era as well as the nostalgia of the revolution. And what I think another value in that is how social movements use this as signifiers to point at what they want, to the future, the possibility that that this form of nostalgia has in order to paint a picture of the future. To me, when I think about this, a picture that comes to my mind is of the 2 years ago, in 2016, the worker movements that in Mashhad, that started in Mashhad, and it was completely a working class uprising, and they went to the Gohar Shad Mosque and hailed Reza Shah. They knew what they were doing. It's a very explicit way of implicitly telling everyone what they're rising against. It's not longing for Reza Shah. It's negating, it's yelling for something that they can't say very explicitly. In the same way, the moment of 2009 had an implicit meaning of trying to kind of, this generation coming into peace with what their parents had done, and they appreciated that at the same time they were angry at, we were angry at. So I think they have this as signifiers. They have a meaning that is beyond this production, or what money is put into this production. And I think if you could also speak to that, that would be interesting.
Maybe we can go down the line, and if there's any of these issues you want to elaborate on or respond to. Why don't you start with Naghmeh and Negar, and we'll come back. We'll have time for other comments.
So I'm just going to make such a general statement that hits on, I think, because everybody's kind of speaking to each other, and that's fantastic. But so and I'm just going to pick Goldenar's because I think it sort of puts it together in a very good way, which is the question of when is nostalgia a private longing, and then when is it something, or my understanding was, or if it's a public yearning for a past, does that make it necessarily nostalgia or not in some ways? So I was thinking about the fact that I really do think nostalgia is a sentiment, and I don't think it is an impulse for action. And one of the reasons I say that is that I keep thinking, if we're going to compare 2009, we should compare 2009 to all the times in which the nostalgia-making machine of the monarchies have called for people to come out into the streets. And people don't, right? So in that sense, I think the last commentary is actually, I'm going to change a little bit what you said, but in some ways I do wonder whether this nostalgia is not another way of airing grievances of the past, of the present, which in and of itself is not necessarily going to translate into action, which doesn't mean it won't, but it's going to come from, I think, somewhere else. And in that sense, I think that bridges this whole gap between the private and the public in some ways. Grievances around the kitchen table, grievances on the streets, it can be presented in a way about Khuda biyamurz. But what it means, and wherever it comes from, does it come from Manoto, does it come from within the kitchen? In some ways, it won't make any difference if it becomes just a symbolic way of talking about discontent in some ways. Maybe that's too optimistic. Do you want to say something? I don't have much to say.
I started by saying, nostalgia sort of seems to be a natural, universal phenomena. Partly, if you take it on an individual level, a simple level, you're talking about 40 years ago. So 40 years ago, you were younger. So you remember yourself as a younger person, and that tends to also give you a different mood to, you will forget some of the things that were going on at 40 years ago. You remember basically yourself 40 years ago. So I think that is partly on a personal level, there is a tendency to, for people to be nostalgic about the past. I agree it doesn't necessarily become political. But on looking at not political side, but on the social side, the reason I really didn't get into the social level is that the people were nostalgic about, let's say, discos or cafes. You're talking about a very small minority of upper middle class. So that type of nostalgia wouldn't go for majority of 80 million Iranians now. So that becomes very class limited. So that type of nostalgia maybe for few people, especially outside the country, remember that, and that may not be there now. Although that type of society is also actually opening up at the moment. Then there is the question of when you look at social changes, people who can say, well, under the Shah there was a great deal of so-called modernization. I don't think that translates into nostalgia, can be used as a usable nostalgia, since the Islamic Republic has actually done better in terms of, expansion of educational system, medical facilities, hospitals, universities. So those type of notion that, well, there was a great deal of social improvement at that time, one could look back nostalgically. That breaks down then when you look at statistics from after the revolution. So the only thing I could say one could grip on as a real reality of the past that people could be nostalgic about is the freedom to wear a headscarf or not wear a headscarf. That you get to an actual concrete issue where you can say, there is rational reason for being nostalgic to what existed before 79. But beyond that, I can't even think in terms of social realm
that you can say there were particular things that in the past that is worth preserving and bringing back?
I mean, I guess I want to pick up where Arash's point about Manoto and its non-production of. I actually want to say that, you know, social media channels, TV channels, all of these commercial channels feed on our nostalgia. They're not actually producing it. I mean, this is what they make their money on. Just as everybody knows, Facebook makes money on our identity. These channels feed on our clicks and views and the attempt to keep our attention. And it's precisely this and the algorithms that run these that, as far as I can tell, stand in the way of any kind of mobilization, whether for the old regime or for a different regime. And I think that is what is of concern here, that they at this particular juncture in history stand in the way of any form of collectivity and any real social conscious action, even fandom around nostalgia. And I think that, to me, is the biggest concern here.
A flurry of hands and somewhat limited time, but I see Syra over here has had a hand up for a while. Could we get her, or maybe you could speak loudly, or
You can just take this.
and then yes, this lady, and then in the back, and then back on 6-3, and we'll see what happens for a second. But please be concise.
I just wanted to mention that the manufactured nature of this nostalgia that you mentioned, I totally agree with you, and especially with regard to Manoto, because as you mentioned, it's not just an innocent memory of the past. You can see how it is being manufactured so that like all these people from the 80 million population, they can feel they were part of that glory that was going on back then, or part of the glamour that you could see in, for example, 2,500-year ceremony, whatever. But aside from that, my question is, because we talked about Manoto, but there's also a new trend, it seems to me, that the political groups who have actually plans for the future, they are kind of being obsessed with the past. So it's not just Manoto who is trying to produce an image of the past. You can also see the Islamic Republic is trying to do that. You can see that there are new movies being made about the special issues that the Islamic Republic till now preferred to be silent about. Like you have at least, I guess, 4 movies about Mujahedin, Khalq, like before the revolution. And there are new documentaries made by Seda Sima. They are trying to give a narrative of the years before the revolution, and they are actually changing their image that they used to offer. Now it's being different. So it's interesting to me that, again, these are the groups that have plans for the future, and the groups inside Iran who are making these documentaries or movies, like Muassaseh Oj, these kind of institutions. These are groups that want to have a role in post-Khamenei era, but they are also obsessed with with the past. They're not offering any specific plan for the future, but they're obsessed with the past. So I guess this is something interesting, and I was wondering if you have also thought about it.
Hi, thank you so much for the lectures. My question is for Professor Abrahamian. I want to pick up on the the story that you shared about how nostalgia can actually kill you. I feel like today the Trump administration is really feeding on this nostalgia, and if you look at their Instagram account, for example, the State Department always shares pictures and memories that would, it seems that they want to manipulate the audience, and you see ads that are running that work on this nostalgia with a specific purpose. And to me, I'm just looking for a solution of what can we do in this modern age where what's important is really going viral, and facts don't always go viral. I know, we can talk truth, but I don't think we would have the same audience, and I don't think it would get around as much as when we're spreading lies. So I, as a student, I feel hopeless, and I really would love to have an answer of how to push for facts and how can you make your audience interested in this. Thank you.
Yes. No, me?
Which one of us?
I'll give it to you. I'll do 2 minutes, I'll give it to you.
This is talking.
Yeah, I keep this under 2 minutes. Thank you very much for the speeches. I was passing through the town. I'm so glad that came to listen to this. I just have a comment to make. I have the advantage and disadvantage of have never watched Manitou. So, and as far as longing and nostalgia about the grandma and grandpa, one thing everybody knows is they'll never come back. So, but if we go 10,000 feet up and look at the history of Iran, the Shah's biggest achievement, which I think it wasn't mentioned here, was his army, the 5th army in the world, which he built. And then you had the dynamics of an army against a defeated people, because the coup of '53 was a back-breaking defeat. And that dynamics created the 1979 revolution. After that, we have a victorious people. Again, the biggest achievement of the Islamic Republic is an army, Sepah Pastaran, that has gone as far as Damascus to prop the dictatorship. So we have, if you look at the dynamics of the future, a victorious people and an army. And who's prodding it? Back then in 1979, it was Washington. At present, it is Washington. So it's kind of hopeful. The only time you have nostalgia as something that can give you something to look for the future is if the society has gone back and you have a past that is brighter than present. Then nostalgia is a force that can guide you. That has not happened in Iran. It's moving forward, so it's worthwhile to pay attention to these large 10,000 feet issues. Thank you.
Yes, don't worry, Arang Ali. This will be quick, and I don't need the microphone. Out of all the inaccuracies I heard, there were 2 points that need to be addressed. One, the first, there was, with all the overfocus on Monoto, which is so discreditable, they referred to anorexics as bodybuilding athletes. There are 2 other propaganda organs that are affected. You forgot to discuss the propaganda machines by the terrorist Rajavi, who also has the ear of the Trump administration, as well, like Reza Pahlavi and the Monoto subscribers, and who are more vocal and forceful for advocating war, as well as you also have the provocateurs from Voice of America, who've been currently stirring up trouble in Iran for years. The second point I'd like to address is about 2009. There is so much over-focus on the post-election violence, so lit that the lead-up to what happened before then. I mean, you had Dick Holbrooke meeting with Mousavi and Karoubi, and you also had me and my other fellow dissidents, royalists with connections, who Artesh and in the Iranian government, who were betrayed by people like Holbrooke and others in America and Iran who manipulated us. So could you please address this?
Okay, I will let panelists decide. If this is a question or if this is a...
I mean, if you... For me, I just wanted to make a comment, not so much about nostalgia, but about facts. And, following up on the comment that, the gentleman who was sitting in front of me made earlier, I would beg to differ with Ervand about, the oil price increases. If you look at the period 1960s, inside OPEC, there are two groups. You're right, Gaddafi and Gaddafi played a role, in price increase as well. There are two groups. Iran, Gaddafi is also a part of it, and also it's Venezuela. Iran and Venezuela are really trying very hard throughout 1960s to get increase in price of oil by cutting production. Saudi Arabia is always in favor of maintaining lower prices, and the reason for that is Saudi Arabia had a much longer term interest in oil production because of their supplies, whereas other countries like Iran, Venezuela, and others that had a shorter time horizon in terms of production, they wanted higher prices and lower production. So there's that, and then it comes to until 1973. These discussions continue. Yes, of course, the Arab oil embargo was very important in oil price increases because, of course, price of oil, depends very much, on supply. And Iran, did not cut production at the time. In fact, it increased production to provide enough oil, for the West so that, there is not a major sort of confrontational problem with the West, but in fact, if you look at, I was involved with some of the technocrats of the time, in Iran. They were very hard working, on terms of trade issues and how oil prices are. Oil is buying less, for what it sells to foreign countries and so on. So there was, we can look at things, in a sort of a more gray way. Sorry.
Let's give the panelists, if they'd like, to have the last word on facts or fiction.
No, I just wanted to say, look, I think now we're muddling the waters, which is great, but I think nostalgia is an emotion, and then fake news is something else. They do intersect, for sure, and I think the anxieties produced right now about this issue comes from their intersection, right? But at the end of the day, I can say as a non-nationalist Iranian that that the story that people tell about Iran has always been non-historical. So there's nothing new in the sense of the narrative that is being produced. Those of us who grew up with this idea of the great nation of Iran, 2,500 years, whatever, that is also a manufactured narrative that is not historically accurate. So I only say that to say maybe one thing we should do, taking Professor Abrahamian's talk as our entryway, is to ask ourselves, why is it that the nostalgia that is being produced by Manitou, by other places, in this particular historical moment, is creating the kind of anxieties that the nationalist discourse and rhetoric that we've all, who are Iranian, have grown up with, does not produce that. And maybe the answer is in that particular thing.
Yeah, I'd also like to distinguish between, on one hand, use or misuse of history, which is very prevalent. Most political organizations will do that. From nostalgia, which is much more amorphous, vague. The notion is somehow in the past things were much better, which is much more a sentiment rather than when actually, let's say, the Pastars or Mujahedin or someone rewrites their history in a favorable light. That's basically a traditional use or misuse of history, I think very different from the mood of nostalgia.